Welcome to Room at the Table, an opportunity for you to join me, Betsy Cerulo, and my guests for conversations about creating equitable and inclusive workplaces where leaders rise above mediocrity and our teams thrive. Pull up a chair. There's always room at the table. Welcome to another meaningful conversation on Room at the Table. I am Betsy Cerulo, your host, and welcome to my guest today, Dr. Steve Yacovelli, owner and principal of Top Dog Learning Group. Today, we're talking about how leaders can successfully navigate through chaos. So pull up a chair, enjoy your favorite beverage, and let's get started. Welcome, my friend.
Hello, Betsy. It's so good to see you.
Aw, same here. And this is so befitting that we are having our conversation during this time, and that our podcast is going to show up during Pride Month, because whatever's going out on the world, our community has a lot of pride and a lot of strength, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So I know as we go on in our conversation, Steve, we'll talk more about what you do and the impact you have for companies. But what I want to start with, since we're talking about leadership and chaos, what do you see occurs for leaders when chaos lands on your path?
Oh, that's such a good question. And sadly, as time ebbs and flows throughout our respective professional journeys, you see this happen. Chaos pops its ugly head. And, there's I think they attribute to Socrates that the only constant is change, and many people have kind of said something like that over the years. And it's very true. And I think now more than ever, one of the things that smart leaders really embrace is one, knowing that, what is now will not necessarily be what's going to be tomorrow. But more importantly, how do you set yourself up, as well as your team and those around you, to be resilient when whatever change comes a knocking? And I think smart leaders are already thinking about those ways. Change is not comfortable for a lot of folks. I mean, it hits that cave brain of ours. It makes us feel quote unquote unsafe. But how do you set yourself up so that you're flexing those resiliency muscles, regardless if it's at a changing time or not?
Right. Yeah. Interestingly enough, this morning I read an article from Fast Company, and it was talking about the top end Navy SEALs and about chaos. And there was one Navy SEAL in particular. Everything across the board was perfect in terms of credentials. But when it came to the plan being chaotic and really running awry, he just couldn't keep up with it. And I think too, in this environment, we can have the best laid out plans, and it's how we respond to the chaos. So, in your work at Top Dog, what practices are you suggesting to have our organizations and ourselves on smoother waters as often as we can?
No, it's another great question. One of the things that we do within the business, and if I can just back up for a little bit, kind of talk about where our doghouse sits for those who have no idea. They're like, what's this dog trainer doing on Betsy's podcast? No, I don't train dogs. We train humans. I've been doing this as a profession in some way, shape, or form for about 30 years, doing my own gig for about 17. But I always say that at Top Dog, our doghouse sits in the center of four very different but insanely complementary areas. We focus on what we call essential leadership. So that kind of that leadership one-on-one stuff that a lot of people who are promoted in the workplace maybe didn't study how to be an effective leader. They studied to be an awesome accountant, and all of a sudden they're head of the people and they're like, what do I do? So we kind of help them kind of guide along. We do what we used to call inclusive leadership. Now we're calling it welcoming leadership to get away from some of those naughty words these days. But really, how do leaders create that sense of belonging for anyone within their workplace? Doesn't matter who they are. We focus, of course, on LGBTQ plus leadership, my personal area of passion. A lot of my books and my keynotes are focused around how we empower our rainbow family as well as our awesome allies to be more inclusive and more successful. And then what we're talking about right now is resilient leadership. How do we set ourselves up as leaders as well as our teams to be resilient in times of change? And we do these four areas in a bunch of different channels. We do keynotes, training classes, all that good stuff and all that. But one of the things that I bring this up because when we talk about resilient leadership, we actually do a lot of conversations with leaders, especially now, on how you start to have those conversations with your team. And one of the ways we approach it is let's talk about just the top three strategies that you can use to build you and your team's resiliency muscles. So it's things like having that positive perspective. It's really having that what we call a healthy self-concept. And it's really getting yourself comfortable with that uncertainty or that ambiguity. And so we channel our energy there first, because the idea is if you can get these three under your belt and you can say, yeah, this discomfort, having comfort with this uncertainty, this ambiguity, great. Then we can move into that times of change and kind of rinse and repeat and flex those resiliency muscles accordingly.
When I see you brought up those three areas and the comfort with uncertainty, there's nothing about leadership that's certain, right? Except how you respond to it. And I have certainly, like many of us, have been tested since January. And I find that I'm getting used to uncertainty. And it also helps me to think more broadly. So when I've been hit with a couple of curveballs, I keep thinking, okay, if I didn't have these curveballs, I wouldn't be learning something new. It may not feel good, but that's the self-talk I have to use to get myself to the other side of it. Because like you said about being positive, it may not feel real positive out there, but when you're leading a team, they're looking to us at the leaders to navigate through. And if we're panicked, then it's going to just seep into the environment.
Yeah, and just when we talk about, and this class I created years ago prior to starting my own gig, one of my stops was at IBM, and I was a change management consultant, and that's where I really fell into the concept of understanding resiliency because at the time, my awesome IBM tech friends would sit there and they create some really amazing technical solution. My team was in charge of getting the humans to use it, and so we had to go in and understand, okay, so how are people thinking? What else is in the environment for them? At one point, we were on a client engagement, and we were doing this one. It was a utility company. We were changing some of their business processes pretty significantly, but we were one of 17 enterprise-wide changes happening at that one moment. We're just like, who authorized these? This is really bad because humans have a saturation point, and depending on your resiliency, your saturation point may be one changing thing versus some others that might have like maybe 5 or 6, and that's just the workplace. Then you think about the changes that are happening at home and in our society and all these things. So, I can really see where some people who especially, who maybe don't look at the world in that most positive light, that glass is always half empty. And, positivity, it's not like, my former Disney coming out, oh boy, everything's great. It's not that. It's, okay, well, that was a crappy day, but what's a good thing that came out of it? That's resiliency. And if we as leaders can kind of train both ourselves and our teams to look at it, even in those, as that children's book says, the terrible and horrible, no good, very bad day, if anyone knows that book, even when we have those days and we could say, you know what, okay, what went well today? Fantastic. Now we're going to move that needle a little bit better when resiliency is often needed in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. In our weekly staff meeting, at the beginning of the meeting, we start with, what are you most proud of? And then we talk about what are the challenges and disappointments, because there's always a balance. Mm-hmm. I would love to come to meetings with no challenge and no disappointment, but it's part of life. Some days everything goes exactly how I want it. It is perfect. And other days it just gets totally sideswiped. And again, as a leader, it's all about our response to it, not necessarily the reaction. Because I think I'm more resilient when I respond than when I react.
Yeah. And it's funny, this ties with a lot of the other things that we talk about in our leadership programming. And if you're not watching the video, I have a graphic up here. These are the 6 leadership competencies that, in my experience, really make or break the difference. They are authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. And yes, if you're looking, they are through the rainbow flag because I actually use that in a lot of our LGBTQ plus leadership in my books. But these are the 6 that I see, regardless of who you are, make or break. And what I hear you saying, Betsy, is that empathy one. If we let ourselves get emotionally hijacked when we're in that stressful time, when change is happening or the day's not going exactly how we expect it, there's that handling ambiguity thing. Yeah, then that's going to impact the rest of the folks around us because emotions are contagious. Mm-hmm. And that could be a good contagion or a bad contagion. And we can kind of manage that as successful leaders.
You know, when I look at communication, I think about some incidents recently where I had to just handle something that occurred. I notice that when I see people's emails that are filled with a lot of emotion, and believe me, we have emotion. I will sometimes write an email that's the communication is filled with the emotion. I don't have the person's name in the to, but I get it out. And then I write just the facts.
Yeah.
And I find that there is less charge for me when it's the facts. And the response that I get back, the other person may spin or do whatever, but I have kind of cut through the nonsense and get right to the solution. And it's not an insensitive email. It's just, here's the facts.
Yeah. Well, but what you just did there, Betsy, is one thing that some leaders really struggle with, and that's having self-awareness.
Yes.
And saying, some people just pull that keyboard and and they do hit the enter key, or they do have someone in the to, and then it sends off, and then they realize maybe the error in their mistakes. So having that self-awareness and that self-discipline to say, you know what? I can see that I'm in an emotional space right now, and having that emotional intelligence that, I'm going to hold off and not hit enter. I'm going to save that as a draft and then revisit that when, you had that coffee or whatever beverage of choice. And then you sit down and, like you said, revisit it and then say, okay, here's the facts now. And let's kind of move forward.
Because I find that there's a lot of time spent towards reading between the lines when communication doesn't have that mindfulness or that awareness. And when you're in chaos, you don't have a lot of time to, what is she thinking? Or what is he really thinking? You ask. And many times I will tell people, whether it's on my staff or any of our contractors, pick up the phone and have the conversation with someone.
And I also think that, I totally agree. And I also think too that, our own personal bias on the channels of communication, we prefer kind of get in there as well. I don't know how many times, especially from a personal perspective, I'll get that text message like, Kay, I'm like, oh, is that okay? Are you mad at me because you're really short? Yeah, exactly. And so we default to the channels we have a bias towards, maybe not necessarily thinking about the channel that's one for the recipient or recipients is maybe better. And then two, what is the right channel for this particular message, not just the preference of the person, but, hey, I'm trying to talk about something very sensitive. Maybe that's having a town hall meeting with me and the team, or a Zoom or whatever. Or it's like, send an email will work just fine.
I marvel, and I'm horrified sometimes with the nature of some of the emails that I receive back, because I think to myself, the person that has sent it, don't they realize that now it's in writing and you don't get rid of it? So here's your proof of your behavior. I know. It's almost as though there should continuously be. Every leader needs to take email communication 101 at least once a year to remind them, don't put this in an email.
Legal friends love those trainings.
But, with all the work that you've done, tell me, what do you recommend what not to do in times of high stress?
The email piece that we just talked about is high priority for me. And I think it's not just email. It's being mindful of those who are around you, even in a physical space. Emotions are part of who we are. And one of the things I talk about in some of our training programs, there's a book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, the Heath brothers. And it's a great book. I've actually, I just helped edit Dan's last book, which I was very excited about.
Wonderful.
But yeah, it was really cool. So, but one of the things they talk about, and they actually borrowed this from an NYU professor, but it's a concept called the elephant and the rider. And basically all humans are that image, the rider sitting on top of an elephant, but the rider is represented as the rational side of us, the logical side, where the elephant is representing the emotional side of us. Now, the difference between those two entities is absolutely on purpose, because at the end of the day, if that rider pulls the reins with that elephant and says, go right, where does that elephant go? Where do you think? right? Or
It
say,
should go right, but sometimes it goes left.
if it wants to, exactly, because that elephant's pretty darn big.
Right.
So, and that's how us humans are. Our emotions, if we let our emotions, if we want them to go one way, they will. But if they decide they want to go in a whole other direction, as my Disney work wife at the time, years ago, still a great friend, she talked about the concept of getting emotionally hijacked, and that happens to us. And so I think that. One, we talked about the email piece, but two, I think it's getting back to what I shared about you, Betsy, is having that awareness. And emotional intelligence is a massive thing that I feel is very underrepresented in the leadership space. A lot of folks don't think about what is their own emotional intelligence when it comes to themselves, and how do they regulate that? What about the emotional intelligence of the rest of your team, having that social understanding on what's happening, what's being said, what's not being said? And I think if you're a leader who maybe doesn't have that highest level of emotional intelligence, there's an area of opportunity, we used to say at Disney. And I think that's really where people should start focusing. Where's your awareness? And if so, what can you do to start getting that awareness where you need it to be?
Mm-hmm. And, I notice too, when I feel really stressed out, I will get up from my desk, I will take a stroll, come back, and then regroup again. And I think the pause button is so valuable for anyone, even if we're with our spouses and we're in a disagreement. You step back, take a breath, pause, and then come back to the conversation. Whether you renegotiate a different time or you can get right back into the moment, you have to step back in high stress.
Yeah. Yes, you do.
You really do. So tell me, I want to give you some more time with Top Dog.
Okay.
Especially in these times right now, and especially within our community. What are you seeing and how are you advising us?
It's been a really, as I'm sure many folks listening and working can know, it's been a very interesting time since even before the turn of the year. So with my business, and like I said, 17 years old, and we have a handful of clients. I mean, most of our clients are Fortune 500s, large non-for-profits, mainly in North America, but beyond. And we have various depths of relationships we have. Some of our client partners, such as a couple of our big pharma and things, we've been doing all their leadership training for 16, 17 years. Other folks, I'll come in and do keynotes and stuff. And so what I'm seeing is a variety of changes depending on the 4 areas of focus for the business. The inclusive leadership piece, we'll start there, is really struggling. It's either clients have just said, nope, we can't do this. I had one just the other day say, we really want to, however, we have a lot of federal contracts and we're concerned. So we're going to just pause that program indefinitely. Others, like our LGBTQ leadership program, those are usually funded through employee resource groups, which of course get their money from their diversity, equity, inclusion departments. And so those have either been gone or thrown away. We are seeing an uptick in the resilient leadership, shockingly so.
Yeah.
And then one of our biggest clients for the essential leadership program, our leadership 101 stuff, happens to be one of the public broadcasting entities whose funding is on the mark. And they've come back and said, yeah, we still want to do this. We don't know if our budget's going to be there. So it's like, oh man. And then, throw on top of this, like I said, I do a lot of keynotes and things. And in 1 week, 4 potential keynotes all came back and said, we would love to have you. However, we're in Canada and you're American and we can't spend money on you right now. I'm like, dadgummit. I mean, I understand that, but it's just been this weird perfect storm. And so for my little business, it's been interesting. And also, it's not just me seeing a lot of these things. And I think having conversations with other folks who are either touched deeply or just getting hit by some of this, it is going back to some of those concepts of resiliency and saying, okay, so glass half full. I'm not being a rose-colored glasses kind of business owner. Sometimes rosé-colored glasses, I will admit. But really sitting, okay, so I hate the term pivot now ever since COVID, but that's kind of where we're at, and my doctorate's actually in instructional technology and distance education. So I've been Zooming before Zoom was a thing, even well before COVID. So now it's okay. So maybe where do we lean in something like that, which is not, I mean, it's still being authentic with the work that we do, but maybe it's focused focusing on some of those areas like resiliency or like virtual presentation skills, which is, what we're also moving into, which really falls under the essential leadership piece. Everyone needs that, but really leveraging into those areas that have broader appeal, can have impact and value, but maybe aren't as sensitive right now, without never throwing that away, of course, still focusing on all the free leadership stuff that we do for our career community and beyond.
What I find interesting, the way I guess society now has been viewing the word inclusive, and I look at the inclusive leadership. So what about the people that are already in leadership that don't fall in certain categories? Correct? So everybody needs a boost of not energy, but wisdom.
Yeah.
So it's still needed. And I just think that people need to reframe looking at that word. Leadership encompasses so many things. Mm-hmm. It should not be a negative word now. And that's what makes me sad about it.
Yeah. And that's where I get frustrated. I mean, I've been teaching inclusive leadership my entire career, basically. And it's never been like, oh my gosh, you have to do all these things. And if you're this type of demographic, you should feel bad about what history did. I've never done that. I do know that there have been some DEI practitioners, sadly, who have. And so, but I've always started the conversation first defining what diversity really is. And there's an awesome model I've been using. I don't know if you know this one, Betsy, or not, the 5 layers of diversity. And it's by 2 women, Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe. They were kind of pioneers in the DEI space, back when, early SHRM days, Society of Human Resource Management. And they came up with an idea, like, how do you organize the concept of diversity? And so they created these 5 layers, and I'll just very briefly share those. The first is, they say, all humans are 5 layers. At the core of who we are is our personality. Every human who's listening, who's watching, there will never be another Betsy. There'll never be another Steve, even if we had twins. We are unique, and that's because of our personality. So that automatically makes us diverse. Then you have the next layer out, which they call internal dimensions. And these are things that, for the most part, don't change over the course of your lifetime. Gender identity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability, age. Now, obviously age changes each year, but for the most part, these are things that don't change. But sadly, for better or for worse, I guess I should say, this is the only place that a lot of people go when they think of diversity. And it's a yes and kind of mentality, because the next layer out is what Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe called the external dimensions. Now, these are things that truly impact how we look at the world, but they can change very frequently. Things like my income, my personal habits, my religion, my physical appearance, my recreational habits, background, work, parental status, marital status. These are all different things. So I usually stop here, and we always bring this up in every training class we do, and we say, who here is a parent? And various people said, you look at the world a little differently than people who are not parents. It's not better for worse. It's just different. Like, I'm not a human parent in this life. I'm a canine parent. So I have a different perspective than my friends who have human kids. I get it. It's just the way you look at the world. That makes us each unique. And that's also diversity.
Diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next layer out is organizational dimensions in relationship to the group that you're a part of. So if you say in the workplace, it's your functional level, the division, your seniority, if you're in a union. I started adding legacy organization because I work with a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and you're like, oh, your former blah, blah, blah company. Like, you hear that a lot. And so these are also different ways you look at the world. Oh, I'm in sales. I'm looking at it through this lens. I'm in accounting. I'm over here. I'm on the front line, whatever. And then last, they added country of operation. So, and this is not fairly new, but newer than the other 4. And they said, what? We do have to acknowledge that wherever you sit in the world and you're operating out of does have influence on how you're looking at the world, such as the political systems, the values, business etiquette, all these different pieces and parts do contribute to how you engage and look at the world. And I often use, I have a lot of German national clients. We work with North America. I don't know how that happened. I don't speak German, but it is what it is. But you do see how that country of operation does permeate beyond the individual personality, like for something like timeliness. Not stereotyping, but as a culture, Germans think of timeliness in one way versus some other cultures. Not better, not worse. It just is. And you see that come into fruition. So I just love this model because I really think it takes the concept of what diversity is and really blows it out to be better and more inclusive, ironically enough. And I think that's what frustrates me when, as you said, is, when people talk about diversity, I'm like, you are so going just to one dimension and barely even that.
Right. Even when we have some of the organizations we know from NGLCC, the large corporations, they have to manage all of their offices differently because of where they're placed in the U.S. So climate is even has diversity. You're going to handle things, someone who's, say, near Alaska, different than maybe someone who's in Florida.
Yep.
And these seem like common sense ways to look at it. And what I wish is that there was more information. And I know there's a lot, but there's ways to place this type of information with the people that are looking at all the conspiracy theories or whatever news outlet to really understand, okay, this is coming up a lot in political conversations. Let's talk about what diversity really means.
Yeah.
Because my feeling is if you send something like that out, and maybe if you've changed a handful of people's opinion of what diversity is, then you've started to break that mold.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been going to the conversation where, I say, have you seen the changing room and the baby changing station in men's bathrooms? They're like, yeah. I'm like, that's diversity. What? Yeah. Like, have you seen a Braille menu? That's diversity. That's inclusiveness.
Right.
And it gets people thinking beyond the hot button titles that are out in the media. And it's like, it's a yes and. But I bring up that whole 5 layers of diversity model because I even talk about handedness. I know a lot of left-handed. I'm right-handed, but 12% of the global population-ish is left-handed. I know my left-handed friends back in elementary school really looked at the world differently because they only had like 2 left-handed desks, and like all the left-handed kids were fighting for them, or there was like 2 pairs of left-handed scissors, and it's like that's a level of diversity, having enough so that people all are accommodated for. It's not right. It's just like being a kind human, but we've suddenly made it this big political drama, and which slowly impacts a lot of businesses, not just mine.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with more information out there, like you're sharing, it gives the opportunity for there to be some change in thinking.
Yeah.
So, there are times that leaders are faced with fighting the good fight over again. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that you've said that. It's funny. When I was writing my last book, Pride Leadership, and I got to the chapter on culture and shaping workplace culture, specifically how that looks, there's 2 parts of that conversation in that chapter, as well as in my latest book, Your Career, and all of our stuff, because it's a personal thing. You have to decide. There's 2 opportunities. You go out and you say, let's talk about, you're in a workplace, whether you're owning the workplace or you're part of an organization, and you want to see, is it being as inclusive as you'd like it to be? Maybe that's because they've pulled back from all the political rhetoric, whatever the reason. So, you first do your research. Is it as exclusionary as you expect it to or not? And so you kind of gather the data and see, is it really yes or no? And then the second step is you decide, do you want to put up the fight, or do you want to pick up your toys and find another organization that's going to appreciate your authenticity differently? And I think that's the conversation a lot of folks are having. It's very public. Some of these organizations, these big companies who used to be in our corner or were perceived to be in our corner, who now are perceived to not be. But I think our first spot is, are they really? I know a lot of my client partners who said, Steve, we're still going to do what we do with you, but we just can't call it what we were calling it, just to kind of, and I'm like, you know what? I think that's a little lack of courage, but I also understand that, you have a $1 billion contract with the federal government and you don't want to bring a, target onto your face, no pun intended. And so I kind of can start to see that. I don't feel good about it, but I also understand what's called context and where we're at in the world. And, like one of my client partners, actually one of my coachees with a big tech company. And I asked him, I said, what's going to happen next month in June, in Pride Month? Is your company going to put the rainbow O on your logo like you do every year? And he's like, you know what? I don't think we are, but we still are doing all these internal programming events for Pride. And we may not be at the next Pride parade throwing out swag, but they're still supporting us as best we can and creating that sense of belonging, knowing that there's this context and situation, but also communicating that to all of our internal stakeholders. I said, you know what? I think right now I could be okay with that. Now talk to me in like 3 years from now. If that's the norm, maybe not, then that seems like we're sliding back too far.
Yeah, agreed. And I know some of the conversations we're having in the Maryland LGBT Chamber and the foundation is where we would have created certain programs. Now we're looking, well, what is drying up? It's a lot of funding and grants. So we have to start shifting. Then maybe part of our purpose now, there needs to be more emphasis on how can we open up those, those lines of financing and giving people a place to come to. They're new organizations, not a lot of money, but still there's one other place, a new place where they can come to start looking at what could be possible. Can you give me anything? So we're in that mode right now of rethinking how do we want to roll out some different programs that will support the community so people are not, so they don't go without.
Yeah. And I think, as I look at some of the folks who I interact with who have, quote unquote, dissolved our diversity, equity, inclusion department, wink, they've just split them now. Part of it is in legal, part of it's under HR or learning development or somewhere else, but the work is still getting done. And I was like, okay, if that's what we need to do in the interim, okay. If we have to make that pivot, but I think as long as in the spirit, we're not just, throwing it away to be like, oh, you don't like this? Okay, now we'll focus over here. Well, that's a really big sign of performative allyship in the past, and now we know, and we will remember that going forward.
Every community has gotten smarter because we've had to fight many fights for decades. So I kind of look at it that, okay, so now I'm going to look at it differently from an elder perspective than in my earlier years in the community. And the pendulum always swings.
Yeah.
We just have to know that as the pendulum is swinging, we're moving towards moving into more chaos. And it's how we respond to the chaos that allows us to make the difference, the good difference.
Yeah. You just gave me the vision of Miley Cyrus on her wrecking ball. We're just riding along.
That's right. That's right. Because those of us who have been out here for a long time, you can't silence us. You can't stop us. It's just, we've just gotten more creative.
And that bell has been rung. I mean, and what gives me hope is all the data that there's all the rhetoric about like, oh, people hate diversity, but there's actually some really amazing studies that happened within the last year looking at what people think. The first one I thought was really fascinating, and actually this one's even outdated because it just came out in January. Gallup, asked how many queer Americans are there, and last year it was 7.6%. Now it's like 9.2 or 9.3 or something like that, self-reported as of 2025. So there's the amount of LGBTQ plus identifying people. I mean, when they first started asking in 2012, people identified 3.5%. It's not like there's a lot of gay folks happening. It's like we're more comfortable coming out.
Right.
But the data I absolutely love the best is looking at when you ask Gen Z, what percent do you identify as LGBTQ plus? And it bumped up to 28%, according to a Gallup study. And then what's even cooler about them is in 5 short years, not even 5 years, they'll be 30% of the workforce. According to the data. And then 83% of Gen Zers say, you know what, whatever company I work for, they better be focusing on DE&I. And that's not changing. And so if you're a company out there who's trying to scramble and do like short-sightedness to appease a minor demographic that's very vocal, you're really going to cut off your nose to spite your face when in 5 short years, a third of your workforce is looking for you to be doing DE&I like items or efforts. And they're going to be like, ooh, I'm not coming to you.
That's
and now
right.
you just lost a third of the workforce because of what you do and what you value.
That's right. This is a perfect time where the majority knows what to do. We really do. And we have to, if you go, you go back to your, the flag, we have to have the courage. And sometimes the courage is hearing something that we know doesn't sit right.
Yeah.
You don't have to have a barroom brawl over it, but you can interrupt the conversation and just say that makes me feel uncomfortable. Because one of the ways that we have coached our contractors across the country if something comes up is you can say that what you've said makes me uncomfortable and I don't want to participate in the conversation. So you're not telling that person they're wrong, but you're kind of gracefully exiting from it.
Yeah, I love that you said it. I just put this graphic out on some stuff I read, and it's titled, if you're not seeing it, it's titled, How to Have Conversations with People Who Disagree with You. And it's just those rebuttals or conversation starters. And some, I think, all of us who've been in this fight for a while already knew, like, well, what shaped your perspective to get there? Or something to that effect. That's a really interesting vantage point. What is some information that personally got you to look at it that way? Or how does that personally impact you? And then you start to one, pull off the people who are just parroting sound bites versus this is how they really think. And then you're actually engaging in a thoughtful conversation versus, oh my gosh, just set the black up, and blank up. And, and you don't look like, you don't agree with how I'm agreeing with things. And they're like, no, let's have that conversation in a respectful way to really start to parse out who is maybe someone we can have a conversation with versus those who are just really into certain television stations and radio shows and they just parrot what they hear.
But what's really valuable here is that you're teaching people to ask questions. And a lot of times that's the safest place to be if you ask questions. Now, don't ask the question with an edge.
Exactly.
Be neutral, ask the question. And it's in receiving the answers allows you, how should I continue the conversation?
Exactly.
So you can stay in that kinder space that's not as chaotic.
Yes.
Perhaps. So, well, Steve, this conversation has been so informative, valuable. It gives me hope. So what I want to ask you in closing, what would you like to share with our leaders about what you do and just to kind of bring it all together?
Yeah. And so if you find you or your organization is looking for assistance in helping with that leadership 101 kind of things, that inclusive or welcoming or insert whatever's the right way, belonging leadership. If you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, reach out to me. We do a lot of good free and also for pay programming on helping amp up your leadership skills, including my last 2 books might be of value. And also resiliency leadership. Or being resilient in times of change. That is something I think we all can use. And so feel free to reach out. I'm sure it's going to be in the show notes. But however we can support you in those 4 areas, really, really, really want to help get us all through this particular weird and wonderful time that we're in.
Well, real quickly, for those that are listening, how can people reach out to you directly?
Probably the easiest thing is to go to topdoglearning.biz, B-I-Z. You can find out information about myself, my team, the training classes we offer, the freebies that are out there, all the blog stuff that we're doing, and topdoglearning.biz is probably the best way.
Wonderful. Well, Steve, thank you so much for today. As always, I appreciate your heartfelt approach. I appreciate that you are such a warrior for every community that you touch. And I'm just thankful that our paths have crossed.
Thank you, Betsy. And thank you for creating this space. I think it's super important now more than ever.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time today. Make sure you reach out to Steve and learn more about what he does. And whatever you're doing out there, just make sure you make a difference and do it with kindness.
Thanks for listening to Room at the Table. If you've enjoyed this episode, follow us on your favorite listening platform and share this episode with a colleague or 2 or 3. For resources to help you lead with purpose and build more equitable workplaces, visit roomatthetablepodcast.com.